They called it the decade of convenience. Every ad, every glossy magazine, every smiling housewife seemed to promise one thing: that the future had finally arrived, neatly packaged in chrome and pastel. But Margaret Andrew knew better. Futures didn't arrive. Someone had to build them. She was born in 1914, old enough to remember the hum of factory sirens during the war and the silence that followed when the men came home. Like many women who'd filled those empty factory floors, she was expected to go back to her kitchen, to trade the sound of engines for the click of a stovetop. And she did almost. The kitchen was small, bright, and lined with good intentions. Her husband, Jack, had built the cabinets himself, proud and practical. But Margaret couldn't help noticing how the sink splashed too high, how the washing machine tangled itself into knots, how the new electric range hummed unevenly like a radio out of tune. Where others saw chores, she saw circuits. Where others heard clatter, she heard design flaws. So while her neighbors swapped recipes, Margaret kept notes, sketches on envelopes, equations penciled beside grocery lists, tiny improvements no one had asked for. "You always were the tinkering kind," Jack would say, half smiling, half worried she'd electrocute herself one day. By 1949, she'd already taken apart the washing machine twice, each time putting it back together with one less noise and one more idea. Her friends teased her gently. "You should have been an engineer, Maggie." She'd just shrug. "Maybe I still am." It started with the wires above the kitchen table. She hated the way cords draped over the counter like lazy vines, catching on flour jars and coffee tins. One Saturday, she rewired the entire wall, rerouting outlets, labeling circuits with neat letters, then tucked the cords out of sight. When she flipped the switch and the lights came on, steady, silent, she felt something click inside her too. It wasn't just about light. It was about control, about claiming a space that the world had labeled domestic and turning it into a workshop. Soon, word spread quietly through their Ohio neighborhood. Margaret fixed the toaster again. Margaret can get the motor running. Margaret says she can make it safer. They came with kettles, irons, radios, the quiet parade of things that powered modern life. And Margaret, apron dusted with flour, screwdriver in hand, became the town's unofficial engineer. That winter, she sent her first letter to the Maytag Corporation. It was short and polite, suggesting a way to stop the overflow of rinse water in their new model washer. She didn't expect an answer. But 3 weeks later, a typed envelope arrived. "Dear Mrs. Andrew, your observations are of great interest to our engineering team." They invited her to visit the plant in Newton, Iowa. Jack insisted on driving. "Can't have my wife wandering into a factory full of fellas with wrenches," he joked, but his voice carried something softer: pride, maybe, or disbelief. Inside the factory, the air smelled like oil and soap. Machines clanged in rhythm, and men in white coats took notes on clipboards. Margaret felt small at first until one of the engineers asked how she spotted the design flaw. "I washed my sheets," she said simply, "and I listened." There was laughter, not cruel, just startled. But when she showed her sketches, the room quieted. She wasn't guessing. She was right. On the drive home, Jack kept one hand on the wheel and one on her notes. "They'll remember you, you know," he said. She smiled out the window at the cornfields, silver with frost. "No, they'll remember the washer that doesn't flood." And maybe that was enough, because Margaret Andrew didn't dream of fame. She dreamed of a world where women could fix what needed fixing, not because they were allowed to, but because they could. That night, she rewired the porch light, humming the tune from a radio ad that promised modern miracles for modern women. She laughed quietly to herself. Maybe the real miracle was a woman who knew where every wire went in her house and in her life. Spring came late that year, the kind of cold that clung to everything. But Margaret didn't mind. She had blueprints to finish. After the visit to Maytag, her mind buzzed louder than the motor she'd fixed. She spent her evenings sketching, measuring, writing in tiny, looping letters. Jack joked that he barely saw her anymore. "You've got one foot in the kitchen and one in the laboratory," he said. She smiled. "That's balance." The idea had started simple, a self-regulating valve that could sense when rinse water rose too high and redirect the overflow automatically. It was practical, small, invisible, the kind of thing that worked best when no one noticed it. And that was exactly what Margaret liked about it. When she mailed her designs, she didn't expect much. But a month later, another envelope arrived, heavier this time. Inside was a formal letter and a contract. Maydag wanted to license her design. She sat at the table for a long time, reading every word. By signing below, Mrs. Andrew agrees to transfer full rights and ownership. It wasn't the money that made her pause, it was the word transfer. That night, she and Jack stayed up late, the only sound the ticking of the kitchen clock. "I'm no lawyer," he said, "but they'll probably make a fortune off this." Margaret smiled sadly. "That's not what I'm after." "Then what are you after?" She thought for a moment. "A name. On something that works." Weeks passed. She signed nothing. Then one afternoon, a man in a dark suit appeared at their door. He introduced himself as Mr. Collins from the engineering division. Polite, confident, with the faint smell of tobacco and train smoke. "Mrs. Andrew," he said, setting his briefcase on the table, "we're impressed with your idea. But you must understand patents are complicated things, best handled by professionals." "I understand," she said evenly. "I just think I've handled it well so far." He chuckled. "Indeed, but the paperwork must bear someone's name, and we'd hate for that name to be." He paused, glancing around the kitchen, misfiled. Margaret folded her arms. Meaning that we'd list it under the department's patents. Standard practice, you see. You'd still get a thank you note." She looked at the note he already had prepared. It was typed. "Dear Mrs. Andrew, we appreciate your valuable input." That's all it said. No name attached, no signature space, just polite erasure, printed on heavy paper. She handed it back to him. "Then it's not my input, Mr. Collins. It's my invention." For a moment, the man looked genuinely taken aback. Then he smiled the way businessmen do when they realize they've underestimated someone. "Very well," he said, standing. "If you wish to proceed, our legal team will contact you." They never did. The next winter was hard. Work slowed, bills grew, and the world moved on. Maydag released a new model washer with a built-in overflow regulator. The magazines praised it as a marvel of modern engineering. Margaret read the article twice. The photos looked familiar, too familiar. Jack slammed the magazine shut. "They stole it." Margaret just sighed. "They used it. You should fight it." "And say what? That a housewife in Ohio fixed their washer?" "Who'd believe me?" He didn't answer. Neither did the world. But that night, as the wind pressed against the windows, Margaret opened her notebook again. She flipped to a clean page and began to draw, not to prove anything, not to win, but because her mind refused to stop making sense of things. By 1953, her name had quietly reached the engineering community, not through headlines, but through whispers. A letter arrived from a woman in Iowa, a design student who'd read about her contribution in a local paper. "You make me believe that maybe I can do this too," it said in neat blue ink. Margaret smiled. That was better than a patent. In time, she did receive one, a proper U.S. patent, number 2,778,215, granted in 1957 for an improved water control system. It didn't make her rich. It didn't make her famous. But it was hers. Her handwriting in steel and wire. Years later, when the television ad showed perfect kitchens gleaming under bright lights, Margaret would shake her head. "They think progress is shiny," she'd tell Jack. "But real progress just hums quietly and gets the work done." Sometimes local schools invited her to speak to young girls about invention. She always brought the same message. If something doesn't work, Don't wait for permission to fix it. Just fix it. When she passed her old washer in the laundry room, she'd still rest her hand on it like an old friend. You started all this, she'd say with a grin. And the machine, in its quiet way, still worked. Steady, loyal, and smarter than before. By the time the 1970s rolled in, the world had changed its colors. The kitchens weren't pastel anymore, they were avocado green and burnt orange. Radios had turned into televisions, and the jingles that once sold modern miracles now promised lifestyles. But in Margaret's little house in Ohio, things hummed the same way they always had: steady, quiet, dependable. She was older now, her hair silvered early, her hands still sure, but slower. The washer she'd rebuilt 2 decades earlier still stood in the corner, paint faded, motor strong. Sometimes she'd smile at it the way others smile at family portraits. It was, in some quiet way, her proof that progress could be kind. Jack was gone by then. Heart trouble, the slow kind that sneaks up like a long winter. She missed the sound of him humming behind the newspaper, the smell of pipe smoke drifting through the hall. But his tools were still in the drawer, and his pencil marks still lined the edge of her workbench. He used to say, "You've got the head for fixing things, Maggie. I just build the table you do it on." And in a way, he'd built her whole workshop. Every month or so, she'd receive a letter from a college student, a young woman, sometimes a teacher, people who'd found her name tucked inside an old engineering magazine or in the patent records. "I showed your design to my professor. He said he hadn't realized women were inventing back then. My mother says you remind her of herself." Margaret kept them all in a cigar box, wrapped in a ribbon that used to belong to one of her aprons. She didn't answer every letter, but she read each one twice. Some she cried over, not out of sadness, but recognition. When her niece asked once, "Do you ever wish you'd gotten more credit?" she laughed. "Credit?" she said. "Honey, every time someone does laundry without flooding the floor, that's credit enough." In 1976, an article appeared in a local paper. Homemaker turned engineer helped shape the modern washer. It wasn't flashy, just 2 columns, a black and white photo of her in front of her workbench. She wore her best Sunday dress, but kept the screwdriver in her hand. The journalist asked her if she considered herself a feminist. "I don't know," she said. "I just thought things ought to work right." Then she smiled. "And maybe people too." After that, a local high school invited her to give a small talk for Science Week. The auditorium was half full, mostly girls in bright sweaters, whispering, giggling, curious. Margaret stood at the podium, papers trembling in her hands, and said softly, "I used to think inventions were made in big labs by men in coats, but some of the best ideas start when a woman looks at a broken machine and thinks, this could be better." Silence, then applause, warm, real. The kind that starts in one heart and spreads like light through a room. As the years went by, her eyesight dimmed and her hearing slipped, but her mind stayed sharp as wire. On quiet evenings, she'd sit by the window, the hum of her old washer filling the house like a familiar song. Sometimes she'd wonder what her life might be been if she'd worked in a proper lab, surrounded by chalkboards and schematics. But then she'd smile. She already had. It was just called a kitchen. One afternoon, her neighbor's teenage daughter, Sarah, came by with a broken hairdryer. Margaret took it apart slowly, showing her how the wires coiled and connected. "Electricity's just a polite guest," she said. "It behaves when you understand it." When the hairdryer roared back to life, Sarah's eyes widened. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Margaret smiled. "I don't know. I just listen to what things need." The last entry in her notebook was dated June 3, 1981. The ink was shaky, but the thought was clear. Machines break, people doubt, but fixing is a kind of faith. She passed quietly later that summer, surrounded by the quiet hum of her inventions still working. When her niece cleaned out the house, she found the cigar box full of letters. the original sketches, and a washer still running perfectly. One of the local newspapers ran a small obituary. Margaret J. Andrew, homemaker and inventor, passed away peacefully in her home. She held several patents and a reputation for never letting things stay broken. Years later, her great-grandniece stood in front of a modern washing machine digital display, stainless steel, and noticed a small note on the patent plaque inside the company museum. Water Regulation System, 1957 M. J. Andrew. She smiled. It wasn't big, wasn't highlighted, just a name on a list, but there it was, proof that quiet things can last, and that sometimes the best revolutions begin in someone's kitchen, under a bare bulb, beside a cup of cold coffee, with a woman who refuses to stop thinking, because history doesn't just remember those who shouted the loudest. It remembers the ones who kept working, the ones who wired their kitchens, and in doing so, rewired the world. It's strange, the way inventions outlive their inventors. You don't always notice them working, they just hum quietly in the background, doing what they were built to do. And maybe that's why I think of Margaret every time I hear the washing machine start its steady rhythm, not as noise, but as heartbeat. I never met her. My mother did, once when she was a little girl helping her own mom deliver eggs to the Andrews house down the road. She remembered a woman with bright eyes and rolled-up sleeves, who smelled faintly of soap and solder. She could fix anything, my mother used to say, even when no one thought it was broken. That story stayed with me, maybe because I've always loved the kind of people who build things to make life easier, not louder, and maybe because it reminded me of a truth that doesn't age. The best progress doesn't replace, it repairs. When I grew up, the world had changed again. Machines were sleeker, faster, quieter, and yet, when one broke, we didn't open it up, we just bought a new one. We'd lost something Margaret never did, the belief that things, like people, could be fixed if you cared enough to try. In college, I studied engineering, one of just a handful of women in the program. On the first day, our professor wrote a name on the board, Margaret J. Andrew, U.S. patent to 1,778,215. He called it a small but essential innovation in domestic design. I called my mother that night just to tell her the woman she'd once carried eggs to had a patent number, a real one. And maybe that was the moment I understood what legacy really meant. It's not the headline. It's the quiet proof that something you touched kept working long after you were gone. After graduation, I took a job designing small appliances, coffee makers, blenders, the kind of tools that sit quietly on countertops but shape people's days in ways they never notice. On the first project, I scribbled a note in my sketchbook, "Remember Margaret." Whenever I grew frustrated with the endless revisions and board meetings, I'd think of her, sleeves rolled up, wiring her own kitchen while the world told her to stay in it. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine what she might say to us now, to all the women who still solder, design, invent, and get called lucky instead of brilliant. Probably something simple. Don't stop fixing what's wrong, even if it's working for everyone else. One summer, I drove out to Newton, Iowa to the Maytag Museum. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal polish, the way I imagine her old workshop did. There, tucked in a glass case between prototypes, was a small brass plaque, "Water Control System Margaret J. Andrew, 1957. I stood there for a long time, not because of the invention itself, just a valve, simple, elegant, made to stop and overflow, but because of what it symbolized. A woman, in a time that barely allowed her name on the paperwork, had built something that outlasted her century. I thought about how many lives she must have made easier without ever knowing it. How many mothers didn't have to mop up the floor that week because one woman refused to sign her name away. Later, I found her house still standing, though smaller than I'd imagined. The porch light flickered when I stepped close, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd wired it herself. I left a small bouquet by the door, Wildflowers, the kind that grow without permission and whispered a quiet thank you. Inside my car, I started the engine and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, I saw myself not as an engineer or a woman trying to make her mark, but as part of a long current. Something passed hand to hand, wire to wire, like light that never dies, only changes homes. Sometimes I tell my students about her not as a hero, not as a feminist symbol, just as a person who noticed things and cared enough to make them better. I tell them she wasn't waiting for recognition, and maybe that's why she got it. That she taught us all that creation doesn't have to shout to be heard, it just has to keep working. And when one of them asks, "Do you think she knew what she started?" I smile and say, "Every time you flip a switch, she knows." At home, my own washer hums in the corner, steady and faithful just like hers. It's digital now, smarter than I'll ever be. But beneath the circuits and software, it still owes a small piece of its rhythm to the woman who wired her kitchen and rewired the future. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I listen to it spin soft, patient, certain, and I think of her notebook, her hands, her quiet persistence. And I remember what my mother once said about Margaret Andrew. She didn't just fix things. She believed they could be fixed. Maybe that's what the world needs again, more people like her, and more faith that the quiet ones are the ones keeping the lights on. If this story brought back a memory, a sound, a face, or a time you thought you'd forgotten, take a moment to subscribe. Here, we don't just tell stories, we keep them alive, one memory, one voice, one quiet heartbeat at a time.